How's the journey?
Here we are.
Nicholas, it's great to have you on the episode. Really, really excited about this. I've been consuming your content now.
Oh, have you?
Ever since Rory was raving on about you, I was like, whenever Rory gets excited, I get excited. Whenever I get excited about it, he gets excited.
Rory's
right?
a very generous man, so you have to exercise care. I'm late for this interview. He's been incredibly gentlemanly, making me feel as if it's entirely normal to turn up half an hour late for things, and I'm mortified. But anyway.
Well, you got some creatives on the podcast, so we tend to be very, very understanding.
Well, that's great.
This whole entire process.
That's great.
But do you know what? We'll just get straight into it. So for our guests that don't know who you are, it'll be great for you to give a bit of a summary of like yourself, the work you've been doing, and we can start to dive into some of the bottlenecks that you've been experiencing along the way.
Okay, good. So let me tell a little story is that my father was an economist. My brother and I tried very hard not to be economists, and we both failed. But I'm a kind of roving economist, and I've spent 30-odd years thinking about public policy, economics, the inadequacies of economics, and I've spent the last 5 years fairly intensively looking at the inadequacies of our democracy. And I've been asking very simple questions and looking at things in a very simple kind of way. And when you do that, and sometimes it pays some dividends, and you come to think that you understand certain things that are simple but that people are missing, and you try and point it out to them, and they tell you you're wrong a lot of the time because it takes a while to kind of decompress and to see some of the things that some of the deep structures in the systems that we're all part of.
And when you ask these simple questions, do people give you simple answers?
No, because what happens is that we are, as is natural and appropriate, we're acculturated. We look at that thing over there and we see a chair, and that's what it is. But it's also a bunch of other things. It's plastic, it's wood, it's there, and so if you look at something and you start asking yourself, why isn't this thing working the way everyone says it should work? Is the fact that everyone is preoccupied with how a thing should be actually part of the reason why it's not that way?
So how you categorize a thing automatically then induces kind of biases and habits of thoughts.
Exactly.
Simply as a product of the categorization.
Exactly. But if a thing is a planet, you might not have a very strong idea of what a planet should be. But if a thing is a politician,
yes,
you have a strong idea that this politician is in the House of Commons, and they're doing the wrong thing, and they should do the right thing. And so you can go one of two ways. You can go the way that most politics goes, which is to wag the finger and say, should. Or, well, why isn't he doing the right thing? Are there things about the way we've set this up that mean that it's not doing the right thing? And one way to think about our political system, one way to think about left and right, is to ask ask the question, what is shoulding doing here? What is the desire to look at something and say, you should be not the way I see you, but some other way? And so I would say that the left do shoulding all the time.
Yes.
And the right do suck it up. That's the way it is. And they just don't understand each other in that way. But the right, I think the left have really got themselves rather unmoored through the woke the woke adventure and all that sort of stuff, which was endlessly shooting. And then we say that trans women are women, therefore someone self-identifying as trans, born a man, gone through puberty as a man, goes to a male prison, goes to a female prison, and they have been convicted of a sex offence. It's just completely nuts.
And what's happened to society? Because just like this podcast, I really like the ability for people that even if you don't have the same views, you can at least have a conversation around something.
Yeah.
What's happened in society where everybody's kind of like gone to their direction and they've stuck to their guns and not willing to cooperate and have a conversation? What's happened there?
What's happened is that for the past 250 years, we've set up everything that matters to us and our society as a competition between for and against. Everything. So the very terms left and right, where do they turn up? In the French Revolution, where you sat in the assembly meant whether you were for or against. So everything we have, even when it's brand new, like where did COVID come from? A few months, people go by and they're kind of actually curious. And then somehow it gets a should, it gets an ideological orientation, which is absurd for the question of where did a virus come from to acquire an ideological connotation. We can do it in months. We can do it in weeks. And that's what we did. And that's what we do with everything. And so we can't really and so everyone participates in discussions as if they already know the answer.
It's very interesting. I mean, the distinction I always make is, do you want to win an argument or do you want to solve a problem?
Yes.
Because if you think about probably the worst influence on British politics is the PPE degree at Oxford. In fact, Oxford in general, I would extend it even more broadly and say that effectively it's 3 to 4 years training in argumentation. And therefore the consistency of your rationale is more important than the consequences of the implementation of that idea. Okay. And that, I mean, it always interests me partly because what's quite interesting about the advertising industry is I always joke about this. In most areas of decision making, rationality is the gold standard, and I always argue at advertising it's the bronze standard. Because you go, that makes sense, but it's a bit boring. Can we do something a bit better? Right? And it's always been interesting because it's a different way to think. Because most people are thinking in a way which is, as long as you can create a kind of internal consistency to your model. Therefore, the model is valid and you should therefore apply it very widely, regardless of the consequences. And I think argumentation, and this is why I'm occasionally seen as kind of anti-rationalist, because I think rationality is often quite a low bar in many ways.
But you're associating rationality very much with this idea of having it out between two sides. And so if we're trying to work out something that we don't know much about, well, you might arrange yourself into two sides, but then you will also be both aware that of all the things you don't know. And so anyway, so an argument or a discussion is an ecology of shared things and contested things. And so it isn't the case. So I would say that simply imagining that a discussion, which is a debate between two people who disagree with each other, simply imagining that as a paradigm of rationality is irrational in itself. Because we have to be able to feel towards the truth together, and sometimes I'll say no, I don't think that's right. You might say no, it is right, and then we might say, right, okay, well we've come to an impasse there. Let's go look somewhere else. Or is there another way of looking at things? There are all those things. And in our universities, we teach overconfidence in what we know, all this kind of stuff.
Also, there's a weird thing, which is the urge to be singularly right. The byproduct of that is you automatically reduce the solution set. Because if you have a large solution set, that requires subjective judgment, intuition, and actually probably debate and discussion. And you will actually inform your own opinions as byproduct of that discussion. If you want to be right now, what you do is you limit the number of variables.
Exactly.
Typically, as an economist, you'll create it as a trade-off between two things with a single optimand somewhere in between.
Or, if you're a politician, you will engage in what I call peremptory framing. So you will say, as Tucker Carlson said to somebody in the military, so tell us how your policy of not discriminating against gay people will help us win a battle in Iran. Well, it won't do that. That's not its function. These are human beings. There's a lot of things to think about, but you can frame it in a particular way that you look silly defending what we need is more gay soldiers. They're just different things. And so a huge amount of politics. Think of the two terms, pro-life and pro-choice. Well, those are peremptory framings. What they're saying is you couldn't possibly, could you be anything but pro-choice? Could you be anything but pro-life? And so the whole point of this maneuver is to forestall the possibility of debate. So it's a crazy.
Give you a very interesting example of where debate comes to a better answer. And I've funnily enough, this is where marketing slightly helps, because interestingly in marketing, every individual is a potential market. So you have to be interested in everybody to some extent if you want to actually grow your business. And this was one, I think, that happened in the UK, which was a discussion on effectively taxation of taking airline flights. Okay. And it started off framed in, yes, we should tax every flight people take. Yeah. No, we shouldn't. Yeah. And eventually, I think there was some sort of effectively deliberative democracy took place, and they took a representative sample of people, and they arrived at what was actually a very clever reframing of the whole question, which is basically everybody's got the right to their fortnight in Tenerife, okay? But if you fly in as an individual more than a certain number of times a year, then there should be a kind of sliding scale of how much tax you pay on your flights, which is completely different. If you like, it's sort of squaring the circle between more tax, less tax. Yeah. It's taxed differently. Now, one of the things I said to Transport for London is the whole policy of the what is it? The effectively, there's this clean air area. If you've got an old diesel car, you've got to pay, what is it, £15-20 or something every time you drive into, more or less, into even outer London. And my only argument was, look, there's a huge difference between 100 people paying £20 once and one person paying £20 100 times. If you're a nurse, you've got an old diesel, you've got no choice but to drive into work at 5 a.m, okay? Charging that person £2,000 is ridiculous, and there needs to be some sort of capping system. Or Amazon Prime. If you pay £150 and then you're exempt for 2 years. And then you've got 2 years to replace your car. And this very, very crude effectively, I suppose, one of the things I think Gary Stevenson, I don't know if you've come across Gary's Economics, kind of distant economics channel. Yeah, I know that. One of the points he makes, which I think is a totally valid criticism of mainstream economics, is the single representative agent model, which is you optimize for a single average person. And it's assumed, therefore, that you've optimized for everybody, which becomes, I think, less and less successful in a world where, of its nature, people are just more different in their circumstances. And so, I've always thought that optimized for the average is a fundamental flaw of economics. That, essentially, one of the points Gary makes is it doesn't really capture inequality, of course, because you can have 6 people becoming monumentally wealthy. Yeah, exactly. And as far as an economist is concerned, the economy is doing great.
They always say that there's no one more dangerous than an intelligent person with a fixed mindset, right? Because they'll stick to their guns and they'll bullshit their way through and say enough smart things for people to believe them, right?
This is a great point that Alexander Solzhenitsyn makes, which is, he says, of all the villains in Shakespeare, about 200 people are killed. But in the modern world, the villains have got ideology and tens of millions of people get killed.
Oh, wow. But then going back to the whole conversation, everybody thinks that it's one or the other, but really it's not an or conversation, it's an and conversation. Right? And no one ever considers the and because people are not looking to actually solve the problem. It seems like it's more linked to people's identity now.
Yeah. Yep.
Right? So it's like,
absolutely.
Like I remember when I was at sixth form, and I think it was the time when Nick Clegg, that almost like political run was happening, and I was Labour, right? And I said, okay, but then if I actually just like made my answers based on the policies that I believed in, what would I actually end up being, right?
Yeah.
But then because I put it into my identity that I'm part of a party, it's almost
That's
like
right.
blindly you have to choose one side or the other, right?
That's right. And what you do is you should your opponents and you make excuses for your own side, and you go, well, he didn't answer the question in Prime Minister's questions, but that was because, if he'd done that, then they would have done this really unfair thing to him or whatever. And so this is the same ability to get away from the facts with spin, effectively, sort of self-spin, saying they should have done this, they should have done that.
And it seems like, why is the world, because it was already a little bit like that 10 years ago, 10 or so years ago. It's become even more polarizing now, right?
Yep.
It's almost like, and I think Rory talked about this in the last episode, that if you're moderately left or moderately right, it's almost like no one listens to you.
That's right.
If you're far one end or far the other side,
you're
that's
much
the people
more.
that,
I'll tell you I'll give you the answer to your question in one word. Entertainment. Much more entertaining to run a story about some extreme view, some extreme event. So that's the bias, and it then becomes a tool of political combat. So you'll pick some completely crazy, some crazy proposition from among your opponents. That's political combat.
There's another thing too, which I don't think anybody's remarked on, which is when you introduce prohibition, okay, in the United States, no one bothers with beer anymore. Okay, because what the hell's the point of smuggling beer? It's massively high in volume. Okay. Similarly, if you watch Narcos, they were basically cannabis smugglers. Okay. And they suddenly go, look, if we're going to take all this risk of getting something through the American border, we might as well pack the truck with cocaine rather than cannabis because it's a high intensity product. Similarly, not many bootleggers bothered opening a brewery. It was all high strength spirits. And similarly, if you're in a world where you're not allowed to make a mildly politically incorrect joke, you end up with Andrew Tate. Andrew Tate is the cocaine or the bootleg gin of incorrect opinion. You see,
exactly,
because it's, I suppose,
or Nick Fuentes is the current.
It's kind of might as well be hanged for a sheep as a lamb. So if you're actually going to transgress and there's no distinction made between mild transgression and extreme transgression, well, what the hell, right?
That's right.
Well, they call it rage baiting now, right?
Yes.
And as somebody that obviously like specializing in digital marketing, et cetera, you recognize that you need to do a lot to almost like set yourself apart in the doom scrolling era, right? So you have to do something that jumps out at people and makes people feel something. And I feel like we're so hung up or we're so drained in dopamine excess that it seems like we not only want to experience the dopamine
and adrenaline.
So it seems like we don't only want that in our digital lives, but also in our physical lives as well. And unless something hits a particular note, it almost like doesn't register in people's minds. And is that one of the things that you think are...
Oh, sorry.
One of the things that you think are influencing that?
I think sometimes someone like Ian McGilchrist will say this is Western, and it is Western, but it's now a Western institutionalized in these adversarial structures. And it makes it harder to represent the center. The center is boring. The center is not as immediately, you can't cut through quite as easily.
You can't be completely right as a centrist, can you? Because it's
That's
all a
true
kind of
too.
bargaining thing.
Yes.
I mean, I'm
yes.
intrigued by this as an enthusiastic Georgist, because, of course, one of the reasons Georgism never takes any root is that it's inherently contradictory in that it's incredibly free market in terms of the fruits of people's labours, effort, or indeed imagination.
Yep.
And it's socialistic with relation to what you might call, well, typically land, historically land.
Yep.
You could extend it actually to scarce resources like fossil fuels.
Yes, indeed. And things with rent.
So it was almost a religious distinction, which I think people understood in the 19th century, which is that land and oil are actually the creation of God, and therefore the proceeds from those things should be reapportioned fairly, because the value of your land is as much to do with the efforts of your neighbours as it is of your own. Okay? And I think in the 19th century they probably had a kind of religious way of understanding this, which is why Georgism went very big. I mean, you could extend it also to, Facebook or something if you wanted to. You could just say, okay, there's a kind of Georgist approach to the web, and that certain behaviours become essentially so habitual that the ownership of that behaviour becomes a kind of extractive rent-seeking activity, and it stops in shittification. It stops being value creation. You go from being a property developer to being a slum landlord, effectively. But the Georgist thing is interesting because it's always difficult for it to take seed, because it requires people to be both at the same time left-wing in relation to certain forms of economic activity and right-wing in relation to others. But I think it's actually inherently beautiful for that reason, because it takes what appears to be a contradiction and says, well, the extent to which you deserve to keep the fruits of your labour entirely depend on the social contribution that your labour makes.
Yeah, so it reminds me of a philosopher. He was a scientist, then an economist, then a philosopher, a guy called Michael Polanyi.
Yes, of course.
Who
genius man.
Well, he was he was a liberal. He was a friend of Friedrich Hayek's and a strong free market guy, but he also thought that Keynes was right, and which he was, in my opinion. And what he then did was he designed a system that would be Keynesian at the same time as focusing the interventions of government as tightly around what Keynes had identified as the problem, which is the flow of money around the economy. Got it. And what had happened with Keynesianism is that it had picked up a lot of left-wing baggage, a lot of the idea that for more state investment, more state supervision of investment and stuff like this, more labour market regulation. And so Polanyi designed this system which would be very, very free market, but would toss money into the economy when it needed to be tossed in and suck it back out when it was time to suck it out. So that's another example. That never took off either, because you sort of have to
you have to ride two horses.
That's right. And so the right was successful at peddling their wares so someone like Friedrich Hayek raised his money from the owners of capital, and Labor was much keener on Keynesian policies, which came with a bunch of other accoutrements of the left. So that's an analogy in macro.
He was also interesting, wasn't he? Because he was an early AI pioneer, if I'm right. Polanyi, am I right? Because he invented this whole concept of tacit knowledge.
That's exactly. But yeah, he was he came up with a much more general way to show the way in which once you get a degree of complexity, you cannot govern from the centre. And he, in fact, designed this model. It was a plywood model, and he showed that if you connect up all these planks to calculate, and then you stretch this thing that you've bolted together, if you had to calculate all the changes in angles at the centre, you'd be calculating forever. Whereas you just pull it, and the thing is a big analog computer and works it all out. Anyway, that's a I don't know whether I've explained that
Oh,
very
so
well verbally.
literally the interconnectedness is incalculable, effectively, but that if you do it physically in reality,
it will calculate itself.
It will calculate itself, obviously.
Exactly.
That's it's a bit like the three-body problem or something like that, is it?
Yeah.
But it's easier to do it than it is to try and predict it.
And it's a much better, I think it's a much more general illustration of this point that you can't govern complex systems from the centre than Hayek's argument, which was much more tied
with the
to
price
economics and prices, and then business people ended up being the heroes. And I don't know how that's going right now, but
talking about heroes, we're talking about superheroes before the podcast started, and there's a famous quote from, well, it was from Two-Face in Batman that says, "You either die a hero, or you live long enough to become the villain." Right?
I see.
Which is why, right? Which is why I've always said that sometimes the value of being central, but a little bit to one side, is that you also think about what does the world need right now.
Yeah.
Because sometimes the world needs optimism or like free thinking on the other side. And sometimes you need to almost go back to your conservative views, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think that, but then people don't think about it that way.
No.
They don't go outside themselves
That's
to think, what does the world need right now?
Yeah.
What kind of leadership do we need right now?
Mm-hmm.
And let's pivot to that for this season. Because everybody always thinks that something is like a forever decision. It's never a seasonal decision. And why do you think that people don't consider it that way?
All I can say is what we've already said, which is that memes travel in extremes. There you are. That's a nice rhyme for you. If you want to get velocity on these things, you make them simple and forever and tribal. And left and right.
However, one of the
travel
things
in
I have
extremes.
thought,
Remember
memes
that.
travel
if you
in
take
extremes.
this thing about what scales, okay, and what pointing scale. And by the way, there was a healthy number of Brexiteers whose motivation was essentially localist. In other words, they believed that decisions should be taken by people who actually get to experience the consequences of those decisions close to the point where the decision is made. And I've got friends who are in local politics, okay, and they say it's not actually very partisan. Most of the discussions in local politics are nothing to do with left and right. They're practical. Where do we put this incinerator?
That's right.
Okay.
Yep.
And very occasionally there may be a political angle to it, which is obviously the left-wing people want to put it in the posh area of town.
That's right.
But
That's right.
broadly speaking, they solve problems through intelligent debate. And actually, I would also argue that if you look at polarization and the kind of weird woke thing, it doesn't really exist in provincial or remote areas. So this is the strangest thing, is a New York friend
Big
during
cities,
COVID.
It's very interesting.
So universities can maintain it, the level of weird intensity that makes it possible, and very large cities like New York or London will maintain it. When I moved to Kent, blessed decision in my opinion.
Shout out to Kent.
One of the first things I do is I go to one of these county fairs, okay?
Yeah.
And there are 3 stalls at the county fair. And there is literally, I'm not making this up, the RSPB, bird charity, right? A stall selling joss sticks run by hippies, and a stall selling shotgun cartridges and hunting equipment. And having moved from London, I go, who the hell was the idiot who put these 3 people together? Okay, these 3 stands together, because it was just comical, right? And then I went closer. They were making each other cups of tea. And a friend of mine left New York. I'm actually basically a provincial advocate. I think that urbanization and gains to agglomeration, the idea that economists have forced us all to believe that the future of humanity is living in ever greater population densities.
That was something they came up with about 30 or 40 years ago, and they were saying the opposite before that.
I'm basically, I want to lead the suburban movement. Mock Tudor homes. Everybody's got a lawnmower. Actually, Australia, basically. Right. You like a bit of space, don't you? Now,
well, no, because we're the most urbanized country in the
world.
world.
But on the other hand, your cities are enormous.
Enormous sucker cities. Yeah. Absolutely huge.
But the funny thing was, this friend of mine left New York and he moved somewhere in Montana. And the local co-op which is slightly more upmarket, than I think, than it is in the I like the co-op in the UK. The local co-op was entirely run by transgender hippies.
Yeah.
The clientele of the local co-op was people who turned up in pickup trucks with gun racks.
Yeah.
There was, and he comes from New York, and he just cannot understand what's happening.
Yeah.
But these people coexist completely happily.
Yeah.
I've got a Texan friend who just goes, basically, you don't get riots or anything of the kind because he said, very simple, we're all Texan.
Yeah.
Okay. So the Texanness basically effectively overrides any other differences you may generally experience because you've got your own identity. And I wonder about this because the media, are we effectively allowing our debate to be dominated by something? And this is my big question, which is why I won't get into very woke debates about trans issues on either side. Is simply the opportunity cost.
Well, you basically will be misunderstood. I mean, the
people will willfully
debate
misunderstand
is
what I
built
say
on willful misunderstanding in both directions,
or confected outrage.
And it's no fun. It's absolutely no fun. It's if you are hated for what you believe and people understand what you believe, that's one thing. Being hated because people don't understand what you believe
or willfully
is really
misunderstand.
galling.
Yeah, it's really, really annoying.
It's really, what's the point of that? Everyone's wasting their time and everyone's upset.
And actually, my contention would be that in provincial settings, okay, generally, when you have lower population density and the same people encounter the same people, one thing is you can't become an absolute bore.
Yes.
Okay. You can't, on social media, you can be a single issue fanatic where you talk about nothing but Brexit. Who's that philosopher guy? A.C. Grayling. Okay. You go to his Twitter feed and there hasn't been anything other than an anti-Brexit tweet. And I'm kind of going, look, mate, can we just have a kitten falling off a skateboard, please? For crying out loud. Now, you couldn't do that in a pub setting because you'd basically be known as Boring Dave and no one would talk to you.
So I had this thought about...
I think we should just re-provincialise. I think you just go move back to the country, rewild it. Everybody has a bit of space. We'd all be happy,
So
East Kent nationalism, that's me.
That's very grand, and none of my thoughts are grand in the sense that I'm not recommending any large-scale social engineering, Rory. But just a few weeks ago, I was thinking about, do you remember, Rory, you may well do you know the Royal Society, founded in this town, London, in 1660, and it had a motto in Latin. You remember what it is?
Oh, crikey. Yeah, it's...
Nullius.
Yeah.
Nullius in verba. Except nothing by word. And the idea was that there were all these people around who thought that angels dragged the planets around the sky. Why? Well, because Aristotle said so. Now, I don't know whether Aristotle said that. I think he didn't. But he said that that planets have a telos and they're following their telos or their purpose or their end in life and so on. And there was this incredible idea that we've actually got to actively get that out of our system, and we've got to try to accept only what our experience tells us works. And I'm thinking, nullius in verba, huh? Well, I think the motto of our systems of politics and governance in the cities, not in the country, is omnia in verba. And I don't know whether that Latin is correct.
I think it is, yeah.
But everything's in words.
Yeah.
And there is one institution in our governance structure which isn't like that. And it actually brings up this question that we've talked about before, which is tacit knowledge that is not articulated, and possibly because it cannot be articulated.
How to ride a bicycle.
How to come up with the next word I am assembling in this sentence. That is done with tacit knowledge. I have no fucking idea how I do it.
No.
But there it is. And that is, according to some people, including me, the most important thing, the foundation of our knowledge, not explicit knowledge, but How do we learn to walk? How do we learn to talk? How do we learn to ride a bicycle? How do we learn to interact? All these things are flush with tacit knowledge. But our political system is a meme-driven political system. But in the counties, that's not how people think. And in a jury, that's not how people think. They think, I like that person. I trust them. They're not playing to the gallery. They're not giving me a hard time. They heard what I said, and they last time they heard what I said and they agreed with me. This time they're disagreeing with me. I think I'll try and figure out why. And that's not there in our political system. It's not there in our media system. You can't. You've got to be extremely articulate, very quick, very succinct and determinative if you're asked a question. So imagine saying as a politician, and this is an actual quote, imagine you're the treasurer of a country and a journalist says, when will this recession end? And you say, your guess is as good as mine. Well, you've lost a job. You within a week, you will be out of your job for telling the truth. And that's the world of omnia in verbis.
That's really interesting because I saw a quote online that basically talked about the fact that whoever it was convinced us to leave the village and then to buy it back at a premium, right? So that's effectively how society worked. You had people around you, your family, support, and then you had to go to a completely different location, be by yourself, and go into this rat race so that you can just buy the village back for a higher premium, which is effectively what happens, right? And not only are you on your own, not only you have to buy it for a premium, you also are a sheep towards the mentality and the attitudes of what happens within that location, which is super, super interesting. But I just feel...
a beautiful phrase. That never occurred to me, but that is exactly what's happening.
That's exactly what happens, right? You're just buying...
Well, you're forced to leave the village and then go and buy it back at a premium is an extraordinary way of looking at things.
That's how society is, right? So they convince us that we need these things. They convince us that we need to embody this identity. They convince us that we need to... The films like, there's so many films like Wolf of Wall Street and Sex and the City and all these things that glamorize this city business person life. Even I would say people like Gary Vaynerchuk, who I love so much from what he's done for my career. He got me on this hustle train to want to be super productive and on everything and consume everything. But I think that as people now start to almost like unwire and unplug from the matrix, like I like to say, and are starting to spend more time on God's green earth, we're now starting to think for ourselves a little bit more. I think that the sensationalism that's happening on social platforms, a lot of people are talking about the great like unplug. That's already starting to happen. It's starting to happen amongst the younger audience already. They're starting to realize that this is not where the vibe is, right?
Very interesting thing. When you work in advertising, one of the things you start to notice is the things that are advertised unconsciously without anybody needing to pay any money to do so. And one of them is that, urbanism is wonderful, suburbia is dreadful and small-minded and provincial, and the countryside is full of hicks. That's an absolutely common media narrative. Of course, the other narrative, which is extraordinary when you look at it, I mean, I joke about things like the worst treated thing in the world by the media is undoubtedly the underground car park. I was giving a talk last week in a Norwegian underground car park. They've obviously dressed it up a bit. And I joked that, of course, this is, to me, the most dangerous place in the world, because if you watch a lot of Scandi noir, there is never a film scene set in an underground car park without someone being killed. Okay, so the underground car park, the actual data on, crimes committed in underground car parks is probably quite forgiving. But the other one, which astounds me, because it went on for 50 years, was that rising property prices are a good news story.
Yes, yeah.
And that was sold to everybody.
Yeah.
So that literally now people have a mentality which is, if I spend money on rent, it is completely wasted.
Yeah.
If I spend money on property, it is an investment.
Yeah.
A completely bifurcated idea.
Yeah.
Now, never mind the fact that if you just invested some of the money you weren't spending on a mortgage, you might get a better return.
Yeah.
Or the fact that most of your mortgage is actually going to the bank in the shape of interest payments over 20 years.
Yeah.
But that has created this literal framing where, oh, no, if you're renting, you're just pissing money out the wall, for example.
But then also there's a whole conversation around opportunity cost, right? Because you're now have a mortgage and you're planted in one place.
What can't you do?
What can't you do,
Yep.
right? I think people don't talk about, and if you live in the house, it's not really an investment because you're spending a lot of money to uptake the house. It's only if somebody else is paying for it that's an investment. I think there's a lot of narratives that's just been put out there.
Absolutely right.
Right?
Yeah.
That everybody is just assumed to be like factual and the way that it is, right? The whole you see that with the crypto kind of like space, so buy at the dip, buy high, sell low, all this kind of stuff that's happening. But a lot of it is just about adrenaline.
Yep.
Even though they say this in theory, as soon as they see something going to the moon, everyone buys it anyway.
Yeah.
It's really interesting. We're talking about the meme era right now. And Trump has his own coin.
When he started intervening in the Middle East in a deeply, irrational and random way, it was primatology, it wasn't rationality.
Right.
The only thing I said to my wife is, I said, it's not like all the rational people have solved this problem.
Yeah, well, that's true.
And that was my only defense, which is occasionally, if a problem proves itself ideology-proof, rationality-proof, actually going in and doing something completely random is probably not all that crazy.
Yeah, no, I'm not that critical of of what Trump's done externally. Anyway, that could be read in lots of different ways.
You'll get misrepresented here.
Exactly.
Massive MAGA fan Nicholas Gruen here.
Exactly.
Yes, exactly. Don't worry.
Dear idea.
Oh, man. But talking about countries and running countries, you obviously talked about the fact that GDP is not the only way to measure the quality of how a country is doing at that given moment in time. What are some of the other ways, or what are some of the other symptoms that people should be looking at to be able to measure the current state of a country? Because right now in the UK, as soon as you talk about what's happening, everyone's like, oh, it's a bad times, isn't it? That's just the narrative that's going on around. But is it really bad times? What's happening? It'll be great to get your POV on
that. I've spent a fair bit of time on the question of GDP. It's Bobby Kennedy in 1968 said this famous thing, which is that GDP measures how many guns we make,
landmines contribute to GDP,
weapons, all the things, anything that is run through the economy contributes to GDP. How much we love our children, the quality of our relationships, none of that's in GDP. And so he summarizes this by saying, in other words, GDP measures everything in life except what's most important. Now, that's a good meme, and good luck to him, because I think it was a very important thing to say. And we are a civilization that's been overrun by a craze for material things. However, then there are people who point out that if you go on a holiday or spend it on your education, GDP tells you that you're equally rich after you've spent that money, which is not true, because if you build it into your education, then you have more assets to work with when you've done that. That's one example.
Although not if everybody else does the same thing.
So
we've created a bottleneck here in education, which is we've told everybody that the routes to success.
But you're framing education as a positional good, which it is, but it's also
an absolute good. I completely accept that. Exactly.
And then there are things like...
I think the University of Cambridge is a positional good, and I think that YouTube Premium is an absolute good, actually.
Nicely put. And one way to think about this, and it's a very important thing which economists haven't got anywhere near really, is that I actually there must be some studies of this, but I think our world is becoming more and more and more saturated with positional goods. And positional goods are this maddening thing that have an infinite capacity to spend money and And as you race up the chain, you get no more welfare. So as you spend more and more money on more and more exclusive brands, you don't get anything.
Complicated. I would argue, that there are two kinds of positional goods.
No, Christ, here we go.
So no. There are positional goods which ultimately end up as absolute goods. So my So my grandparents were the fourth family in Wales to own a dishwasher. It cost an insane amount of money.
That's right.
But they were providing early stage funding for the dishwasher.
Anti-skid brakes.
You got it exactly
in luxury cars, and then they
then become available to everybody.
And it's not true of handbags, is it?
It's emphatically not true.
And it's not true of real estate, which is more and more important.
Absolutely
and it's increasingly less true of education, which is your point.
So the computer was a positional good. I mean, most things started.
But education wasn't nearly as much of a positional good 100 years ago as it is now.
No.
So,
completely
particularly in the United States.
Well, this is, I think, Scott Galloway's point, which is the ultimate luxury goods brands aren't Louis Vuitton. It's actually Ivy League universities, which are creating Now, the condition I think that makes it clear which is artificial scarcity. So, if you're artificially limiting the quantity of something you produce.
That's a positional. Well, no, but real estate is not artificial scarcity, but it's
natural scarcity.
Scarcity,
you're right.
So scarcity with status-driven competition, that's a positional good, and that's making us less well off.
There are some good things to consumerism as a positional good, which is, in a consumerist society, a good plumber has a better car than a bad doctor. If you have a status system which doesn't have the consumerist element, arguably your status is kind of fixed by your level of educational attainment age 23, a bit like it is in France. It always has been in France. The first question, literally, someone could be 50 in a French business, and they're appointed CEO, and the first question everyone asks is, where do they go to university? Like that's relevant 30 years later.
Exactly.
They've gone to the École Nationale d'Administration. Fantastic, right? They must be absolutely brilliant. And so there's an element to me which actually supports a level of consumerism in the sense that it is at least attainable by everybody. Whereas other forms of status, particularly if they're conferred by credentialism early in life, strike me as a bit dodgy.
Totally agree.
Yeah.
So, Nicholas, we've come to the time. I wish this was longer.
I know.
I loved listening to this.
We will have to continue it.
We can continue it online.
I'll just appear from the other side of the world.
Like Zordon in Power Rangers.
Here's my point. Now, Martin Wolf in the FT describes Nick as the best economist you've never heard of.
Yeah.
I also explain why he's the best economist, which is that Australian economists are a bit like Australian fauna, that you've evolved in isolation. Right. So, if you see what I mean, if you'd grown up in the United States, you would have ended up as a Chicago school economist or a Harvard economist. But being in Australia or New Zealand, you're sufficiently remote for evolution to take really interesting and new forms, you see. I genuinely believe that about a lot of Australian intellectual life. It's really, really interesting because actually precisely for the same reasons that, Australian wildlife is really interesting.
I hear we had a technical malfunction here. We missed something, actually. And what we got over there? Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Rory. Happy birthday to you.
Oh, absolutely. I will pretend to blow the candles out.
Don't spit on it.
The cameras are still
rolling.
rolling.
That's the most calorific cake I've ever seen in my life. I mean, you're trying to kill me. You're a feeder. You're basically a feeder. But that is fantastic. Thank you very much indeed.